I struggle with depression and deep hopelessness,
Mm,
partially in response to circumstances in my life that aren't very flexible. I'm
mm,
thankful for the Lord's nearness to the brokenhearted and the fact that our tears are precious to Him, but the
mhm.
darkness is still thick. What
Yeah.
are your favorite go-to weapons or strategies you'd recommend for those who want to fight for the feeling of hope, even in
Mhm.
overwhelming trials?
Man, so articulate. I
Yeah.
appreciate the question. It's a powerful question and one that so many people can relate to. You know, all of us have at one time or another in our life been in a very dark place and felt discouraged and hopeless and overwhelmed. And for sure that others are watching this and hearing this are experiencing the same thing. And so I really appreciate the courage in putting words to what many kind of watchers are experiencing and can identify with and connect with. One of the key components to finding hope and experiencing hope is to recognize the relational component to it. All of life is relational, and part of the one of the powerful drivers for depression and discouragement and hopelessness is from an emotional isolation, kind of a internal isolation, which isn't always an external isolation. That sometimes we can be around people and have people that know us, people that we see, people that we interact with every day, and yet our core is kind of held secret from them, that what we're really going through and the real struggles of what's happening in our heart is not known. We're not seen. And so we oftentimes, hear about individuals who in their life complete suicide, and it's just a shock to those around them. They're going, I had no idea that they were struggling. I had no idea what was going on with them, that the enemy had been effective in isolating them, even though they were around lots of people. And so it's completely possible, even if we're externally connected and engaging folks, for internally for us to be very isolated.
What does that kind of look like if you're internally isolated?
Yeah, so one of the questions that I use to get a feel for how connected or isolated a person is in relationship is, I would say, Tori, if you're sitting in my office and you're kind of talking through some of the struggles and maybe sharing the same thing that you just was in this question with me, I would say, man, I'm curious, who in your life could I call right now? Could I pick up the phone and could ask them, how's Tori doing? And they could really tell me the things that you just shared with me. And that they would say, oh, she's in a hard place. She's really struggling with these pieces. And when we were together, we just kind of sat with that. And she allowed me to bear that with her and hold that heaviness with her. And it's a tough season. And could really tell me about being with you in the midst of that struggle that you're in. And for a lot of folks, as they're sitting on my couch, one of the things that is a common thread is I get this look that says, nobody,
Hmm.
like nobody could you call and really knows what's happening in here.
Yeah.
And there's this profound aloneness that's a part of their life and that they're experiencing.
Yeah, yeah, I totally hear that. And I mean, I even think I went through a very difficult season last year, and I even think about, at the time I was engaged to my now husband. And at the time I was very isolated in that space. And I remember, going to counseling and really my counselor being the only one who knew all of the things that I was struggling with. And, now I look back and at this time in my life, in this season right now, my husband knows everything and could be that person. But last year he was not, last year I was in that very isolated internal place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it breeds depression and anxiety because as human beings, it's not good for us to be alone.
Yeah.
Like we see that in Genesis, and we always think about it in the context of marriage. It's not good for man to be alone. And it's totally true. That's relevant and an accurate application of that passage, that it's talking about that, but it's bigger than that.
And
That
how
as
sweet
human
is
beings,
God to think that, to think of that, you know?
well, we think, even within the Godhead, right?
Yeah.
The reality that God Himself exists within relationship.
Mm.
That if you're a Trinitarian believer, there's this idea that Christ exists, or that God exists in three parts: His Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that they're eternally in relationship with one another, and that reflection of God in us says that we are in need of being in relationship,
Mm.
and that it's not just a relationship between us and Christ, which is where a lot of times believers will be in error. And they're going, well, I spend time in the scriptures and I spend time with God, and so I'm not alone. God is with me. And that's true, and that's great. But God didn't create you to live on an island with just He and you. That God designed us to be a part of a body.
That's
And
good. Yeah.
and if I take my finger and I cut it off from my body, it doesn't live very long. It gets pretty hopeless pretty quick, because it can't survive cut off from the rest of the body. And as people, human beings, we're the same way. And the enemy likes to get us isolated and cut off from people, and it becomes a really dark hole. Ecclesiastes talks about the man traveling alone who falls in a pit, and there's no one to help him get out.
Mm.
Right? And we experience that so much in life. It's not always a physical hole in the ground pit that we fall in. We fall into a pit and we're alone, and there's no one to help us out of it. And it's really, really hopeless, discouraging.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so I would encourage you that you're not going to be able to find the hope that you need in isolation. That the road to finding healing and finding your way out of that dark place is going to involve some people in your life. And maybe you don't have any. Sometimes professional counseling steps into that void, because you go, well, how do I develop that? I don't have any safe
Mm.
people in my life. I don't know anybody. I don't even know where to turn. And so sometimes professional counseling bridges that gap and kind of steps in and is kind of a person that can be with you, instantaneously, of sorts, that they've got training and experience to be able to join you in that vulnerable space, and the
Mm.
safety of confidentiality and the professional relationship makes it safe to be vulnerable in that way faster than just finding a friend on the street, or something of that nature. um, but it becomes not an end in of itself. Professional counseling isn't an end in of itself, but a beginning place for learning, how do I create those meaningful relationships that I need in my life outside of the therapy context, so that I can have what it is I need to do life together and hold those things and journey through this tough season of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really good. So that first, that strategy of just finding people, and I even think back to last year, meeting with that counselor, and the more I would talk about it with my counselor, the more that I would express what I was feeling, what I was going through, the easier it was to talk with my fiance about it at the time. The easier it was to open up to him, to open up to a friend, to open up to my mom, to open up to people who
Mm-hmm.
I trust. The more that I would talk about it, the easier it became.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great picture of one of the things that comes out of good therapy, good counseling, is not that it just ends with the therapist, but that the relationship with the therapist enables you to then be able to connect with others in your life outside of therapy in a deeper way, that allows you to really draw in from those relationships the things that you need in order to be healthy.